Next chapter that we're going to look at is the chapter on Sujūd al-Sahw, which is the prostration of forgetfulness. So the Imam begins this chapter, he says, يُسَنُّ سُجُودُ السَّهْوِ لِلْمُصَلِّ إِذَا أَتَى بِقَوْلٍ مَشْرُوعٍ فِي غَيْرِ مَحَلِّهِ سَهْوًا وَيُبَاحُ إِذَا تَرَكَ مَسْنُونًا وَيَجِبُ إِذَا زَادَ رُكُوعًا أَوْ سُجُودًا أَوْ قِيَامًا أَوْ قُعُودًا. So here, basically, he's saying the prostration of forgetfulness, Sujūd al-Sahw, is recommended due to forgetfully making a legislated statement in the wrong place. This is category number one. Permitted if a recommended act is abandoned. That's number two. And obligatory if a bowing, prostration, standing, or sitting is added. This is number three. Three categories. So he's addressing three legal triggers for this prostration. And with those three triggers, there are three different rulings. The first one, of course, we understand prostration of forgetfulness is recommended, as he mentions, for one who utters a legislative statement in the wrong place, and they do so out of forgetfulness, like if they were to recite the Quran during prostration in sujood, or if they were to recite the Tashahhud while they were standing. Except in the instance that they make the taslim, the final taslim, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, before its time, in which case it becomes an obligation to make the Sujūd al-Sahw. So here, ruling number one. And this, by the way, is very introductory into this particular topic of Sujūd al-Sahw. There are many details and things to be considered. However, based on the level of this text, we're just getting a taste of the topic. Okay? He says it's permissible to perform the prostration of forgetfulness, permissible if the person forgetfully omits a recommended act, like forgetting to raise the hands during takbir, not raising them during qunut, for the supplication. Those types of recommended acts that they wanted to do, but they forgot to do, then it's permissible for a person to make this sujood. It's obligatory if the person adds an act from the essential components of prayer. So this is the third category when it becomes an obligation. If they added something such as bowing, prostrating, standing, or sitting, even if the addition of this act is equivalent in duration to jalsat al-istiraha. And that's the very light sitting that is done after the second sujood in transition to standing, if needed. And the need would be somebody who's unable to rise from sujood directly into the standing position due to a physical ailment or a factor which would prohibit them from making that direct transition from sujood all the way to the standing position. So when they're in sujood, they sit up as if they would during the two sajdatains. They sit up, they take basically steady themselves and then stand up. That's known as jalsat al-istiraha. And it's a very short period of time. So what he's alluding to is, if you add something, as he describes, even if it's for a short period of time, then you're obliged to make Sujūd al-Sahw. Actually, that gives you a basic idea of what this prostration entails and some of the cases and associated rulings with that. The next line reads, وَتَبْطُلُ الصَّلَاةُ بِتَعَمُّدِ تَرْكِ السُّجُودِ السَّهْوِ الْوَاجِبِ الَّذِي مَحَلُّهَا قَبْلَ السَّلَامِ. It says the prayer is invalidated if the obligatory prostration of forgetfulness, now remember the three categories: recommended, permissible, and obligatory. So now we're talking about the obligatory category, that the prayer is invalidated if the obligatory prostration of forgetfulness, whose place is before the salam, is deliberately abandoned. Okay, so the prayer is invalidated if one intentionally omits this obligatory prostration of forgetfulness. And he mentions the place. This prostration is performed before the salam. So if one has to pray, if one has to make Sujūd al-Sahw, which are 2 sujoods, then they do that before they exit the prayer with a salam on the right and the left. And this is the general ruling in where it is or when it is that you make the sujood. And if you intentionally omit this, then you will invalidate the prayer, because this constitutes a deliberate omission of an obligation within the prayer. And we've talked about the categories of actions and statements in the prayer, from being a pillar to being which is a rukn, to being a wājib, an obligation, and then to being a sunnah, which is a recommendation. Okay, so here he's escalating this to considering the wājib Sujūd al-Sahw, not the permissible or recommended. So if you intentionally leave either of those, recommended or permissible, then it has no negative impact on the prayer's validity. So I give you an example of this. You're praying dhuhr and accidentally add a 5th rak'ah. After finishing, you realize you made the mistake, and now you know that you have to make Sujūd al-Sahw. And this would come before the salam because of that addition. But instead of performing the 2 prostrations, you choose not to do that, and you go straight to the tasneem, even though you were aware of the obligatory case. And if this were to happen, the ruling of your prayer is that it would be invalid because you deliberately abandoned an obligatory act within the prayer, which is, of course, this Sujūd al-Sahw, which is there to make up for the mistake, the error that was committed by adding here, unintentionally adding a standing, another rak'ah completely. It gives you an idea basically what it looks like in action. The next line he says, وَإِن نَهَضَ الْمُصَلِّ عَنْ تَرْكِ تَشَهُّدٍ أَوْ نَاسِيًا لَزِمَهُ الرُّجُوعُ لِتَشَهُّدَ وَكُرِهَ إِنْ اسْتَتَمَّ قَائِمًا وَحَرُمَ إِنْ شَرَعَ فِي الْقِرَاءَةِ وَبَطَلَتْ بِالرُّجُوعِ بَعْدَ الشُّرُوعِ فِي الْقِرَاءَةِ صَلَاةُ غَيْرِ نَاسٍ وَجَاهِلٍ. If one rises having omitted or forgotten a tashahhud, they must return to perform it. So basically we're talking about after the when you are at the end of the 2nd rak'ah in a 3 or 4 rak'ah prayer, and there's a tashahhud there before you stand up for the 3rd, and you forget the tashahhud and you stand up, you must return to perform it. But there are some details, as he mentions. Returning is disliked if they have fully stood. So the time when you would return without it being disliked is if you started to stand up before you reached the standing position. On the way up you realized, and then you sat back down. You would have to sit back down. Lazimahu ar-ruju'u. You're obliged to now sit back down. You've remembered, or somebody's alerted you to it as you're standing up. Now you sit back down. You don't complete the standing position. If you reach the standing position completely, you can return, but it's disliked. And if you begin reciting, meaning now you're reciting al-Fatiha, you cannot go back. You have to continue forward. He says if they return after beginning recitation, the prayer is invalid, except for one who's forgetful or unaware, meaning forgetful of this ruling or unaware of it. So in the event that they just forgot about the fact that they couldn't return, or whatever the case may be, or they didn't know about that, then the prayer is still intact and valid. Otherwise, a person that knowingly does this, the prayer would be considered invalid. So there you have some cases as to how you go about making a correction in the middle of prayer. In particular, this issue of the 2nd rak'ah and the tashahhud at the end of it. Right? We understand that tashahhud al-awwal is a wājib, min wājibat al-salah. Okay, and so here you can make up for that at the end of the prayer with Sujūd al-Sahw for having missed it. It says, وَإِنْ أَحْدَثَ أَوْ تَكَلَّمَ وَلَوْ سَهْوًا أَوْ قَهْقَهَ أَوْ تَنَحْنَحَ بِغَيْرِ حَاجَةٍ فَبَانَ حَرْفَانِ بَطَلَتْ لَا إِنْ نَامَ فَتَكَلَّمَ أَوْ انْتَحَبَ خَشْيَةً أَوْ غَلَبَهُ سُعَالٌ أَوْ إطاس أَوْ تَثَاؤُبٌ وَنَحْوُهُ. He says here, if someone produces a hadith, speaks, even if forgetfully, audibly laughs, or clears their throat without need, producing 2 or more letters, it is invalidated, meaning the prayer. But not if they sleep and then speak, weep out of reverential fear, or are overcome by coughing, sneezing, or yawning, etc. So if someone produces a hadith, invalidating the prerequisite or condition of prayer of purity, and the Imam is talking explicitly about giving the salam before completing the prayer, like we would all understand that if you broke your wudu during prayer, prayer is over. But here is, if you gave the salam like a premature salam, and now you have time to go back and finish what you missed and make up for it with Sujūd al-Sahw, we're addressing this issue as if we understand I'm out of prayer. I'm not in prayer right now for my wudu to if it was broken, then the prayer would be invalid while I'm in prayer. But now I'm out of prayer because I made the salam and my intention was to exit prayer, and now I've just realized, hey, guess what? I was premature in that, and now I need to go make up for the rest of the prayer. So if I broke my wudu during that short period of time, the question would be, can I go quickly make wudu and come back and just conclude the prayer where I left it off? You understand the nature of the issue? And so the Imam is drawing our attention to the fact that no, you cannot go make wudu and come back quickly to make up their prayer, because that wudu that you started, that tahara you started your prayer with, is connected to the entirety of the prayer, even if it's split by this momentary lapse. So in the event that you invalidated your wudu during this time, where you now had to make up for that mistake of prayer, even though you made the salam already, then the prayer would be invalidated here, because what you have to make up for is a part of the initial prayer that you were mistaken in, and so forth. You could not continue. You'd have to actually go and make wudu and start prayer over from the very beginning. And then he mentions here, if you speak, أو تكلم ولو سهوا, like if you were to speak, be they the imam or otherwise. And now he's talking about whether during prayer or after that premature salam. Even if this is done forgetfully, then it would invalidate the prayer. Or if they were to laugh audibly or clear their throat such that 2 distinct letters or syllables, if you will, were produced and became audible, then the prayer is invalidated. And this is when somebody, especially this clearing of the throat, is when somebody does this on purpose. Like as if I'm drawing your attention to something. And this is a communication in the prayer. It's almost like you're speaking without using actual words and phrases. So 1 time, okay, but 2 now, because that's what would make up a word, is two letters, 2 syllables, or two letters would basically make up a word, and then that would invalidate your prayer. There are exceptions to this, as he mentions. They briefly doze off while seated. They're seated in their prayer, and then they have a quick moment of, that kind of very light kind of dozing. And then they came to, and they said something upon waking. Then this wouldn't invalidate the prayer. It would not invalidate the prayer, because it was done perhaps unintentionally. If they were to weep out of reverential fear of Allah during the prayer, Right? So when they're crying, they're making multiple sounds. It's producing, like I said, like we described as those letters or those sounds are being produced one after the other. But if this is done out of reverential fear, meaning it's not something you're feigning or faking to make noise or to signal or something of that nature, then this would not invalidate the prayer. And of course, if they're overwhelmed by the natural response, like to coughing, sneezing, yawning, or other things like this, like crying due to pain or emotion, this too would not invalidate the prayer. Right, so some of these actions have to be done intentionally so, and that doesn't matter the case. And this is, there is some difference of opinion within the madhab in regards to some of these, like talking there at the premature salam. And you'll find strong argument on either side. But our imam here, he mentions one, and that is speaking regardless the case, وَلَوْ سَهْوًا, even if done forgetfully. And then he goes on and he says, وَيَبْنِي عَلى الْيَقِينِ وَهُوَ الْأَقَلُّ مَنْ شَكَّ فِي رُكْنٍ أَوْ عَدَدِ رَكَعَاتٍ وَلَا أَثَرَ لِلشَّكِّ بَعْدَ فَرَاغِهَا. So anyone who doubts in a pillar, again, it's important to understand the difference between the pillars, the obligations, and the recommendations. Anyone who doubts in a pillar or number of rak'as is to act upon certainty, which is the lesser amount. Doubt has no effect after its completion. So if someone is uncertain about whether they completed a required part of the prayer, like a bowing or prostration, or they're unsure how many rak'as they prayed, the rule is to go with what they are certain of, which is the lower number. And this is because certainty cannot be removed by doubt. And the basic assumption is that the act hasn't been completed unless they're sure it has. So the basic assumption is you didn't do it until you know you've done it. So for example, if someone is in prayer and they think to themselves, did I pray 2 rak'ahs or 3? They should assume 2. They should build upon what they're certain of out of 2 or 3. If they assume 3, well, they're certain it was 2. If they know 2 for sure, then now it's a doubt as to whether it was added to 1 more. They would base it on what they're certain of, and that is 2 rak'ahs, and then they would continue under that, based on that certainty of 2 and move forward to 3. If they were worried about did I pray 3 or 4, then they would base it upon praying 3, and they would move forward from there. And this applies whether they are leading the prayer or praying alone. And then, as he mentions here about doubt after the prayer is concluded, if the person realizes their doubt after completing the prayer, they begin to now doubt what they did after prayer is concluded, that doubt has no effect. So if someone finishes praying and then wonders, wait, was that 4 rak'ahs or 3? They do not repeat the prayer. Once the prayer is over, lingering doubts are disregarded. You need to be certain at that moment. You need to say, wait a minute, did I actually, no, you have to be able to say, oh, I only prayed 3. I'm certain I only prayed 3 when I had to pray 4. And in that case, they would make up for their 4th rak'ah that was missed. It depends. Do they have to make up the entire prayer or just the last rak'ah? In that case, where they said, listen, it was Dhuhr prayer, I finished the Dhuhr prayer, absolutely know that I forgot one. If they didn't do anything and it was like right then and there or shortly thereafter, they can make up for that single rak'ah and make Sujūd al-Sahw. Yeah, but again, if there was a long period of time, or they invalidated their wudu, or as he mentioned here, you started talking and carrying on in a different way, then you've separated the act that's required of you of prayer. So then you would have to pray completely over. Yeah. Before. Should be done before the taslim of the prayer. There may be different views on it, different opinions as to how when the Sujūd al-Sahw is performed. Yes, according to this madhab, this is the general ruling of when the Sujūd al-Sahw is to be performed, and that is before the taslim. With the exception of someone having made the taslim early, then they have a different ruling that it can be done after. Yes. Prostration for an obligatory Sujūd al-Sahw is left off, then the prayer is invalidated. In the event that you forgot that after the prayer, then it's similar to this situation here, where the doubt occurred later on. Yeah. All right, the next section he says, فَصْلٌ أَفْضَلُ تَطَوُّعِ الْبَدَنِ بَعْدَ الْجِهَادِ وَالْعِلْمِ صَلَاةُ التَّطَوُّعِ وَآكَدُهَا كُسُوفٌ فَاسْتِسْقَاءٌ فَالتَّرَاوِيحُ فَوِتْرٌ وَأَقَلُّهُ رَكْعَةٌ وَأَكْثَرُهُ 11 وأدنى الكمال 3 بسلامين ويجوز بواحد سردا ووقته ما بين العشاء والفجر. We move on to the next section about recommended prayers. And he opens this section by saying the most virtuous physical voluntary act after military service and seeking knowledge is voluntary prayer. After military service and seeking knowledge, then you have voluntary prayer. The most emphasized of these is the eclipse prayer, Salatul Kusūf, followed by the prayer of rain, Salatul Istisqāʼ, then Tarāwīḥ, and then the Witr. The Witr, he says, the minimum of which is 1 rak'ah, and the maximum is 11. The least level of completeness is 3 rak'ahs with 2 taslims, though 1 salam or 1 taslim is permitted when prayed continuously. Its time extends from after Isha until Fajr. So the most virtuous acts of voluntary worship performed by the body, physical acts of worship, after we've mentioned striving in the cause of Allah and seeking knowledge. Striving in the cause of Allah is what we call jihād. Here it's been translated as military service. And every people, every nation, honor their armed forces. By and large, that is. They honor their armed forces. It's a required part of a state. And we too, as Muslims, have this built in within the structure of our legal code. Military service and ethics of warfare. So after that, they're seeking knowledge. And so these things, the benefit of them is not personal, not restricted to personal benefit, but its benefit is shared by others. And that's a part of how you rank good deeds. Is the benefit solely yours and yours alone, or is it something that you do that now has a positive impact on the world around you? So typically the deeds that have positive impacts that go beyond you are going to weigh heavier and be more virtuous. After these, however, voluntary prayer, as he mentions here, is among the top. And when we talk about voluntary prayer, we're talking about any non-obligatory prayer. And that breaks down into what is known as the tatawwu', what is known as the sunan, and then there's the nawafil, which like the recommended prayers as specifically highlighted by the Prophet ﷺ. We're going to talk about some of those. And then there are prayers that are like nafila mutlaqa, which are just additional prayers that you add to your routine that haven't been specified by the Prophet ﷺ, but generally permitted when it comes to the types of prayers that you can perform. So among all the voluntary prayers, the most emphasized are those performed in congregation, as we can see, as he begins with the eclipse prayer, Salat al-Kusūf. This is the most emphasized of them all in terms of praying in congregation. And then in importance, it follows the Salat al-Istisqāʼ, which is for rain. And that is immediately followed by Tarāwīḥ, because Tarāwīḥ is a voluntary prayer encouraged to be performed in congregation, especially during the nights of, or I should say explicitly during the nights of Ramadan, that you pray in congregation in Ramadan. Then comes the Witr prayer. This is a highly emphasized sunnah. It's known as Sunnah muʻakkadah, and it's also legislated to be prayed in congregation, especially during Ramadan. Right? The Witr prayer, you can certainly pray it alone, but again, when we're looking at the nature of these extra prayers, these prescribed prayers, which one is more rewarding? Those that are performed in congregation certainly are, and Witr being among those that are encouraged in some form or fashion to be prayed in congregation. The minimum of Witr is 1 rak'ah, and this is not disliked. Even if prayed alone and without excuse. You to pray a single rak'ah for Witr, it's not disliked to do that. The maximum is 11 rak'ahs, between 1 and 11. And this is where some people get confused as to the number of rak'ahs for Tarāwīḥ and Witr. So in the madhab, it's very clear where we arrive at 11 based on reports from of the Prophet's prayer, and that he would not exceed 11 units of prayer. And this is noted by his wife, radiallahu anha. He would not exceed 11 units of prayer at night, and that was the Witr prayer. And then in Ramadan, would pray more. And we also note that the number of rak'at for Tarāwīḥ, based on the relations, I should say, the narrations of the companions, and then their act, or their action, or their leadership in that prayer over the years after the Prophet's passing, and how they treated that. Meaning they didn't confine the Tarāwīḥ prayer to 11 or 13 rak'ahs. They confined the Witr to 11, and the Tarāwīḥ they left open, praying 20, and that's what the madhab considers to be the Tarāwīḥ. But when it comes to the Witr, we talked about 1 to 11, the least complete, adna al-kamal, like a full Witr prayer is at least 3 rak'ahs. The minimum is 1, the least complete is 3 with 2 taslims. So you pray 2 rak'ahs and you make taslim, and then you pray a single rak'ah and you make taslim. And that's adna al-kamal, the minimum level to achieve wholeness. It's also, however, permissible to pray 3 rak'ahs with 1 taslim continuously, meaning without a sitting after the second rak'ah. So you pray 1, 2, you don't sit, you stand up 3, and then you sit and you conclude. And this is in order to distinguish it between Salat al-Maghrib prayer. So we know Salat al-Maghrib is also a 3 rak'ah prayer. There's a Tashahhud after the second rak'ah, then you stand up to complete the third. So we would not treat it like Salat al-Maghrib in this case. Again, Witr prayer time is after Salat al-Isha, and that includes when you combine it with Maghrib prayer at the earlier time. So in the event that you're a traveler and you're going to pray your Salat al-Isha, Maghrib and Isha together at Maghrib time, which is Jammu Taqdeem, combining and praying in advance. It's not prayer delayed, it's advanced, such that Isha prayer is now prayed in the Maghrib time. Once you've prayed Isha, even though it's still in Maghrib time, you can begin to pray Witr right after that. You don't have to wait until the Isha time has actually come in. And so while you can pray it in that scenario, even right after Isha in its normal time, performing it in the latter part of the night is more virtuous. And this is the case for one who trusts that they will wake up in time to make it before Salat al-Fajr. In the event that they're saying like, look, I know I'm not going to wake up in time for this, then it's better that they pray it before they go to sleep. It's better that they pray it in the earlier part of the night so as to make sure that they conclude it. Imam al-Ba'di then gives us the qunut. He says, وَيَقْنُتُ فِيهِ بَعْدَ الرُّكُوعِ نَدْبًا فَيَقُولُ جَهْرًا اللهم إِنَّا نَسْتَعِينُكَ وَنَسْتَهْدِيكَ وَنَسْتَغْفِرُكَ وَنَتُوبُ إِلَيْكَ وَنُؤْمِنُ بِكَ وَنَتَوَكَّلُ عَلَيْكَ وَنُثْنِي عَلَيْكَ الْخَيْرَ كُلَّهُ ونشكرك ولا نكفرك اللهم إياك نعبد ولك نصلي ونسجد وإليك نسعى ونحفد ونرجو رحمتك ونخشى عذابك إن عذابك الجد بالكفار ملحق. He opens up with the supplication. He says it's preferred to make qunut. It's preferred, not wājib, preferred to make qunut after bowing. Saying aloud, this is the, and then he begins recording the dua of qunut. And it means, O Allah, we seek your help, your guidance, and your forgiveness, and we repent to you. We believe in you, place our trust in you, and praise you with all good. We thank you and do not deny you. O Allah, you alone do we worship, and to you we pray and prostrate. To you we hasten and strive. We hope for your rahmah, and we fear your punishment. Indeed, your punishment, your true punishment, surely overtakes the disbelievers. Allahumma hdina fi man hadayt, wa afina fi man afayt, wa tawallana fi man tawallayt, wa barik lana fi ma a'tayt, wa qina sharra ma qadayt, innaka taqdi wa la yuqda alayk, wa innahu la yadhillu man walayt, wa la ya'izzu man adayt, tabarakta rabbana wa ta'alayt. It goes on what means, O Allah, guide us among those who you have guided, and grant us well-being among those who have granted well-being. You have granted well-being. Take us into your care among those who you have taken into your care. Bless us in what you have given. Protect us from the evil of what you have decreed. Surely your decree, or you decree and none decrees over you. None whom you befriend is humiliated, and none whom you oppose finds honor. Blessed are you, our Lord, the Exalted. Allahumma inna na'udhu bi ridaka min sakhatik wa bi afwika min uqubatik wa bika mink la nuhsi thana'an alayk anta kama athnayta ala nafsik. Concluding the dua here, he says, O Allah, we seek refuge in your rida, which is like your pleasure here. Your sakhat, which is translated as wrath or anger. And in your pardon from your punishment, and in you from you. We cannot praise you as you deserve. You are as you have praised yourself. ثم يصلي على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ويؤمن مأموم ويفرد منفرد الضمير ثم يمسح وجهه بيديه هنا وخارج الصلاة. He says here, concluding this portion, then prayers are sent upon the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام after you make the dua. The follower behind the Imam says Ameen to these supplications. Allahumma hdina fi man hadayt. Ameen. Right? The follower says Ameen. The individual adjusts the pronouns accordingly. So when you're praying alone, you're going to adjust the pronouns within this dua to reflect that you're by yourself. The face is then wiped with both hands. And we're talking about when we're holding this is from the manners of the qunut, is to raise the hands. And then when you've concluded with your prayer, your dua, then you wipe the face with the hands. And you do so inside. Huna, he says, wa kharij as-salah, and outside of the prayer. Meaning after you make a dua, even if it's outside of the prayer, then the manner of that is to wipe the face with the hands. There's multiple narrations from the Prophet ﷺ reported regarding this particular act. And the scholars of hadith have deemed, even if some of them have issues as a collective, all of the narrations together strengthen each other if you were to debate their chains of narration. Because of the collective here, they strengthen them enough such that it's something that can be acted upon. And it's considered sunnah, not bid'ah. So when you give these prayers, send these prayers upon the Prophet ﷺ, you could also say upon his family as well, وَعَلَى آلِهِ, if you wanted to. Sending prayers or salutations of salam upon the Prophet, this is explicitly stated in legal text, explicitly mentioned by Imam Ahmad as well. And when we said the follower, the ma'moom, the one praying, says Ameen, they do so without reciting the supplication themselves. So they're basically saying Ameen to the Imam's recitation, his qunut. They don't say it themselves and say Ameen to their own dua. And they say Ameen if they hear the Imam. In the event they're in a scenario where they can't hear the Imam making qunut, then they make dua themselves. I can't hear the Imam making qunut. I know we're in qunut, but I can't hear it because I'm following along by watching. We're in such a gathering that I can see people in front of me. And I know where we are in the prayer. I can't hear the Imam audibly making the qunut, but I know this is qunut, so I'm going to make the qunut myself. In the event that you can hear the Imam, then you would say Ameen to his qunut. The individual praying alone with just the pronouns means that instead of saying Allahumma hdina, Allahumma hdina, oh Allah guide us, you would say Allahumma hdini, oh Allah guide me. Because you're praying by yourself, that is going to be reflected in the supplication, and that's going to take place all throughout the entirety of that dua. Which means you have to have some knowledge of the Arabic language, enough in order to conjugate this supplication, to reflect the singular nature of your prayer. After that, he goes on to mention more emphasized prayers. He says, وَالْrawātib al-muʻakkadah 10 ركعتان قبل الظهر وركعتان بعدها وركعتان بعد المغرب وركعتان بعد العشاء وركعتان قبل الفجر وآكدها الفجر ثم المغرب ثم سواء والتراويح 20 ركعة برمضان جماعة يسلم منه كل 2 بنية أول كل ركعتين ووقتها بين سنة عشاء أو وتر في مسجد وأول الليل أفضل ويوتر بعدها في جماعة. Okay? And then there are 10 emphasized routine prayers. This is known as the Salat al-rawātib, or the Sunnah ratiba. Okay, Sunnah ratiba are the emphasized prayers that are attached to the obligatory prayers. And he mentions them as follows. 2 rak'as before dhuhr. Remember, they're 10 in number. And then 2 after. Then what do we have? 2 after Maghrib prayer, 2 after Isha prayer, and 2 before Fajr prayer. So that gives you 10 altogether. The most emphasized of them is the Fajr Sunnah, which is before you offer the Fajr prayer, followed by that of Salat al-Maghrib, meaning the 2 after Salat al-Maghrib. And then the rest are equal in terms of their level of importance or virtue. So Fajr, Maghrib, and then the rest of them are the same, the other 3. One makes salam every 2 rak'ahs. Tarāwīḥ, and that is a manner, by the way, of voluntary prayer, is that they're done in units of 2, 2, 2, 2 by 2. Pray 2, make taslim, pray 2, make taslim, etc. But he's talking about Tarāwīḥ. I just missed the line. Tarāwīḥ consists of 20 rak'ahs, as I hinted to it earlier, performed in congregation during Ramadan. One makes salam every 2 rak'ahs with an intention preceding each pair. The intention is you're praying Salat al-Tarāwīḥ. Its time is between the Sunnah of Isha and Witr. So after Salat al-Isha, you pray Sunnah al-Isha, and then begins the time for Tarāwīḥ until the Witr prayer, whenever that's made, in the Masjid. The beginning of the night is preferred for Tarāwīḥ. Witr is then performed in congregation afterward. This is what's preferred for Witr, is you pray it in congregation. You don't leave it to go pray alone. That's not the preference here. And there are different ways in which you can manage praying the Tarāwīḥ in the congregation. If you decide that you want to pray more after that and you want to make Witr the last prayer of the night, then you can add a rak'ah, for example, in order to maintain Witr as being the last prayer you're going to conclude with. The intention would have to reflect something different because it's not Witr. Witr requires an intention. But in the event that you're praying with the Imam who's going to pray Witr, his intention is specific. And as a ma'mum, the follower, you can't have a different intention of the Imam. According to the madhab, you can't pray, for example, Isha prayer with the Imam praying Tarāwīḥ. Imam's praying Tarāwīḥ and you came late. and you didn't pray Isha, you're going to say, look, I'm going to join the congregation while they're praying Tarāwīḥ with the intention of praying Salat al-Isha. And when they're done, I'll just stand up to conclude my prayer. The problem is that the Prophet ﷺ, he says that the Imam has been made to be followed. The Imam has been made to be followed. Not just in the actions, but also in the intention. If we could understand the intention as being one of the most important parts of the prayer, then why would you not follow the Imam in the intention as well? You have to follow the Imam in the intention. So in the event that, and we're going off track here as a bit of a detail, but this is a popular question. In the event that you decide, hey, I'm going to pray Witr, I'm going to continue to pray, if you will, with the congregation until the end, because I don't want to do this. Witr is then performed in congregation afterward. That's what's recommended. But you decide, hey, I want to make my Witr later, but I want to pray with the congregation all the way till the end. Then in this case, instead of having the intention to pray Witr, now you need to intend to pray Salah Nafila, Mutlaqa. It's a general voluntary prayer. And the general voluntary prayer is at the heart of every prayer that's offered. It's the baseline of prayer. It's basically you have that salah, I intend to pray, and then you're building on top of that a pyramid of specificity. Okay? So that's how you would manage that in the event that you decided, hey, I don't want to pray Witr with these guys. I want to go home and pray, but I don't want to leave early. I want to finish with the congregation to receive the same reward. And that's how you can handle it. Wallahu a'lam. So these sunnah ratibas, these recommended, highly recommended prayers, these 10 units, they're disliked to abandon them regularly. If they're habitually neglected, it nullifies a person's integrity. It's known as adalah. Basically, you're questionable. Like, I'm not looking at you to be a witness for anything because your adalah is now in question. Your integrity as a person is now in question. Right. That's how the scholars viewed these issues in a very serious manner. So a manner of these extra prayers is to be noted that in the first 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, one recites قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ after Salat al-Fatiha, after Surah al-Fatiha. And in the second, after al-Fatiha, they recite قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. And like that for these ratibas, these sunnah ratibah, this salat ratibah, or sunnah ratibah. You have the same method of praying them with قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ in the first and قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ in the second. This is the recommendation. Of course, you could pray with other chosen surahs or portions thereof. Tarāwīḥ prayer, this is a note, is confirmed, is a confirmed sunnah. It's established by the Prophet ﷺ, and it's not considered an innovative practice introduced by Umar ibn Khattab. And this is considered one of the manifest symbols of Islam, Tarāwīḥ. So we know that the Prophet ﷺ began praying Tarāwīḥ and then abandoned it to retreat back to his house, and was later asked why he did that, and he said because he feared that it would become an obligation upon his ummah, and he didn't want to burden the ummah. So the companions understood from that it's a sunnah, and so they revived that sunnah after the revelation ceased. That was after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, because there was no possible chance that it would now become an obligation or binding. The Prophet ﷺ was passed. Revelation concluded, everything was now fixed. And so Umar ibn Khattab, they continued to pray Tarāwīḥ, by the way, but it was individually, and until Umar ibn Khattab came and joined them together and behind one imam during the month of Ramadan. Okay? And it's also called Tarāwīḥ. This is just a little linguistic note, because what they used to do is they would pray 4 rak'ahs, 2 and then 2, and then they would take a rest from the word raha, means to rest, yatarawwahuna. They would seek a little period of rest in between. Right? Because we know it's a rather extensive prayer. So you pray 2, 2, take a little break, 2, 2, take a little break, 2, 2, like that, until you concluded the number of rak'ahs that you wanted to pray. And in the spirit of the madhab, after you had basically 20 units to pray, so you would essentially have 4 stops along the way, concluding the 5th, I guess, at the end there. And then you pray Witr. All right, the next section here is فصل وصلاة الليل أفضل والنصف الأخير أفضل من الأول ويسن قيام الليل وافتتاحه بركعتين خفيفتين ونيته عند النوم وكثرة الركوع والسجود أفضل من طول القيام وتسن صلاة الضحى غبا وأقلها ركعتان وأكثرها 8 ووقتها من خروج وقت النهي إلى قبيل الزوال. So the next section is about voluntary prayers beyond those specific Sunnah prayers. Now we have a nafila, general. And so he starts with Salat al-Layl. Salat al-Layl is considered a nafila mutlaqa. And I indicated that in that issue about Witr and Tarāwīḥ, etc. Is a general nafila mutlaqa. So Salat al-Layl here, meaning I'm not praying Witr, it's not Tarāwīḥ, I'm not praying Sunnat al-Isha. This is just extra prayers that I want to make because I'm invigorated, I'm inspired, I'm seeking Allah and nearness to Him. There's a number of things. So I'm going to now begin a series of prayers that's just open for me, permitted for me to perform. No specific recommendation other than just pray at night. Right? There's a general recommendation, just pray at night. And so this is going to be what that is here. And the night prayer, consider that general nafila is better than similar prayers performed during the day. Doesn't mean you can't perform these salat nafila during the day. Certainly you can. You can perform these nafila prayers during the day. However, those done at night are more rewarding. Performing such prayers at night are more virtuous if done so after waking from sleep. And this is where you get the terms of Salat al-Qiyam al-Layl and Tahajjud. Qiyam al-Layl is Salat al-Layl, standing at night. And that begins after Salat al-Maghrib until Salat al-Fajr. However that's done, if it's done at night, it's considered min Qiyam al-Layl or Salat al-Layl. But Tahajjud is the night prayers performed after you fell asleep and you woke up. There's a difference between the two. And falling asleep and then waking up is more virtuous than not having fallen asleep. You just stayed up the whole night, you didn't sleep. And you can understand why that is. Because having to wake up out of your sleep requires from tahajjud, some jihād. There needs to be some effort put into it. It's a bit of a struggle and there's some hardship. So with this greater hardship comes greater reward. ويسن, he says, قيام الليل وافتتاحه بركعتين خفيفتين ونيته عند النوم وكثرة الركوع والسجود أفضل من طول القيام. So Qiyam al-Layl is recommended beginning with 2 brief rak'as, and its intention is to be made before sleep. So in the event that you don't actually wake up, you would have at least made the intention, and inshallah you'll be rewarded for your good intentions. Frequent bowing and prostration are more virtuous than prolonged standing. So that means you would make the rak'at shorter. I mean the standing parts of recitation, you would make them shorter so that you could perform more ruku and sujud. Frequent bowing and prostration are more virtuous than prolonged standing. So as opposed to standing for long periods of recitation, it's better to break them down into shorter periods such that you can have more bowing and prostrating throughout your duration of prayer. So if like, look, I got an hour to pray. I've got an hour to pray. I can pray 2 rak'ahs in an hour. I'm going to read in them 20, 25 minutes each, reading and then be done. Or I can pray 10 rak'ahs. I'm just going to break it up into pieces, smaller recitations, and that would be the ticket for you. That would be the best. وتسن صلاة الضحى غبا وأقلها ركعتان وأكثرها 8 ووقتها من خروج وقت النهي إلى قبيل الزوال. We're talking about صلاة الضحى. It's recommended every other day. Recommended every other day. And that's based on the combination of reports about the Prophet's habit was that he would pray, and sometimes he wasn't noted to have prayed Salatul Duha. And so it's something that you can do every other day as a habit. Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam, preferred that this prayer be made regularly every day if the person wasn't able to pray during the night. So if it wasn't from their habit to pray Qiyam al-Layl, essentially this would fill in the gaps for them, the Salatul Duha. And it's made with a minimum of 2 rak'ahs and a maximum of 8. And its time period extends from the end of the prohibited period, which is after the sun rises, the height of a spear, until shortly before the zawal, which is basically when the sun's at its peak. He says, وَتُسَنُّ تَحِيَّةُ الْمَسْجِدِ وَسُنَّةُ الْوُضُوءِ وَإِحْيَاءُ مَا بَيْنَ الْعِشَاءَيْنِ وَهُوَ مِنْ قِيَامِ اللَّيْلِ. Also recommended are Tahiyyat al-Masjid, that's greeting the masjid with 2 rak'ahs. That's prayer upon entering the masjid. Sunnat al-Wudu, this is also 2 rak'ahs after making wudu, and enlivening the time between Maghrib and Isha. That means to pray after Maghrib and Isha, just nafilah, and this is considered a part of Qiyam al-Layl. You can see there again, وَهُوَ مِنْ قِيَامِ اللَّيْلِ. Right? Even though it's after Salat al-Maghrib, you haven't gone to sleep, you're just praying nafilah, this is min Qiyam al-Layl. وَتُسَنُّ صَلَاةُ الْإِسْتِخَارَةِ وَلَوْ فِي خَيْرٍ وَيُبَادِرُ بِهَا بَعْدَهَا. So here, Salat al-Istikhara is recommended, and this is like when a person is concerned with a decision. And this can be, and this is recommended even for choosing between good options, like making Hajj. Should I make Hajj this year, or how should I make Hajj with this group or that group, or go this way or that way? These are all good options. You can make istikhara for even good options. And what follows should be acted upon immediately, meaning once they've made istikhara and the maslaha, or like the benefit of the decision they want to make, presents itself, then you just go for it. Tawakkalna ala Allah. You go for it. You don't need to hesitate, resist anymore. You've basically done your istikhara, which includes seeking advice from those that have background in what it is that you're trying to decide on. You make that istikhara, and then you push forward when you see that there's something that's been presented to you. Makes sense? Looks good? Everything, you go for it. And then you'll know whether or not that istikhara, what the answer for the istikhara was based on how things transpire after that. If things are falling in place, everything works out, it's easy, like, okay, this was meant to be. If now things aren't happening, I'm getting shut down, I can't seem to make it, I missed the flight, passport expired, I forgot to renew, blah, 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 all those things, they canceled, then you go, oh, I guess it wasn't meant. It wasn't meant to be. قَدَّرَ اللَّهُ مَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ. All right? وَتُسَنُّ صَلَاةُ الْحَاجَةِ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَإِلَى آدَمِيٍّ وَتُسَنُّ صَلَاةُ التَّوْبَةِ وَتُسَنُّ وَيُسَنُّ السُّجُودِ تِلَاوَةً مَعَ قِصَرِ فَصْلٍ لِقَارِئٍ وَمُسْتَمِعٍ. Okay, cool. He says, likewise, Salatul Hajjah, whether for a need with Allah, the Exalted, or another human, is recommended, which is 2 rak'ahs. If you have a need that needs to be fulfilled, whether it's a need from Allah or from another human being, you can pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's reports of this, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to see to the fulfillment of that need. Also Salat al-Tawbah, it's the prayer of repentance. And this is also 2 rak'ahs, which is then followed by seeking Allah's pardon. So in the event that you've committed a sin, you go and make wudu in the best possible way, you pray rak'atayn, and then you seek forgiveness. Prostration of recitation is recommended for both reciter and listener. Prostration of recitation, this is known as Sujūd tilawa. And this is someone intentionally listening along with the reciter. It's not referring to someone that is just happens to hear the reciter, but you have to be intentionally listening to the recitation. And this is performed by making takbir, then sujood, and then takbir to rise, followed by a sitting and an immediate taslim. No tashahhud involved. And this is provided the interval is brief, meaning the interval between reciting that ayah of sujood and when you're going to perform it. Right? If you allow a long period of time to go by, then you've missed, it's basically expired. You missed the time. Okay, so we understand these are all recommendations. وَيُسَنُّ سُجُودْ شُكْرٍ عِنْدَ تَجَدُّدِ نِعْمَةٍ أَوْ اندِفَاعِ نِقْمَةٍ. The prostration of gratitude is also recommended when a blessing, a new blessing is received or a calamity is averted. عِنْدَ تَجَدُّدِ نِعْمَةٍ. If you get a new blessing or the renewal of a blessing, if you will, or the calamity or a hardship is averted, and this is performed in the same manner as the sujood for recitation. Sujood tilawa and sujood shukr are considered prayer, and so they are bound by the basic conditions of prayer. You understand those things like having wudu, facing the qibla, being properly dressed, etc., etc. All those things have to be met in order for you to perform these extra recommended acts of prayer. Sujūd, tilawa, sujūd, shukr, and they're both performed. Takbir, Allahu Akbar. You make sujūd, Allahu Akbar. You sit, and then you make the taslim. Okay, one is fine, but making taslim on one side is enough, but making two is what's recommended. The last section we're going to look at today says, وَأَوْقَاتُ النَّهِي خَمْسَةٌ مِنْ طُلُوءِ فَجْرِ الثَّانٍ إِلَى طُلُوءِ الشَّمْسِ مِنْ صَلَاةِ الْعَصْرِ إِلَى الْمَغْرِبِ وَعِنْدَ طُلُوئِهَا إِلَى ارْتِفَاعِهَا قَدْرَ رُمْحٍ وَعِنْدَ قِيَامِهَا حَتَّى تَزُولَ وَعِنْدَ غُرُوبِهَا حَتَّى يَتِمَّ. So here he says there are 5 prohibited times. So basically, we talked about all the extra prayers and their voluntary nature and the reward, etc. Now we're saying, wait a minute, but there's also some stipulation here in terms of when those can be done and when they cannot be. There are 5 prohibited times from the start of the second Fajr until the sun rises. The second Fajr means that's when the adhan is called. When the adhan is called, a prohibited time starts until the sun rises. The sun rises when it comes above the horizon. From Asr until sunset. From the beginning of the sun's rising until it ascends. From the beginning of عند طلوعها إلى ارتفاعها. So when it begins, so the first one is from طلوع الفجر الثاني إلى طلوع الشمس. So the sun's getting ready to rise. And then this third one is when it's rising until it's reached the height of a spear, rumh, in the horizon. That's number 3. Number 4 is at its zenith, meaning when it's at its peak until it declines. And you know that based on the shadow, right? The shadow of the object. Once the sun reaches its zenith, its top, there's no shadow cast, or the shadow that is cast is not going in either direction, east or west, right or left. And you'll know that that is finished when the shadow is now cast in the opposite direction or it begins to move. This is based on what latitude? This way? Longitude. What is this way? So based on where you are here, north or south will depend on the nature of the shadow of the sun to an object. So if you're at the equator, then that's when you're going to get no shadow at all. But as you begin to go up or down, then there will be a slight shadow that's cast, even when it's at the zenith. Okay? And you would kind of adjust accordingly. And then the last one he said, at its zenith until it declines, and from the last one, from the beginning of its setting until it's fully set. فَيَحْرُمُ فِيهَا ابْتِدَاءُ نَفْلٍ مُطْلَقَةٍ لَا قَضَاءُ فَرْضٍ وفعل ركعتي طواف وسنة فجر وأداء سنة فجر أداء وجنازة بعد فجر وعصر. He says during these times it's categorically prohibited to begin any voluntary prayer except for making up a missed obligatory prayer, performing 2 rak'ahs after tawaf, the on-time recommended Fajr prayer, that's Sunnah al-Fajr when prayed on time, or a funeral prayer after Fajr or Asr. Okay? Because it's impermissible. All right, we understand here. Certain things, you can't pray during these times. There's a few exceptions. The exceptions are specific exceptions to praying during these prohibited times. And we'll look at, so he mentions 4 here, and we'll look at a few more shortly as we wrap up. But the 4 here that he mentions, except for making up a missed obligatory prayer. So in the event that you missed your Fajr prayer and you wake up late and it's during the prohibited time, you pray right away. You don't wait till that time's expired. You pray right away. You make up your obligatory prayer. Or performing 2 rak'ahs after tawaf. You are making tawaf and you know after tawaf there's 2 rak'ahs. Doesn't matter what time it is, because tawaf is allowed to be done anytime. The associated 2 rak'ahs are allowed to be done anytime afterwards, regardless of whether it's waqt nahi or not. The on-time recommended Fajr prayer Meaning, remember, the waqt al-nahi begins from the adhan of Fajr until the sun has risen above the horizon, the height of a spear, based on what you see. It's qadr rumh, right? That's what that phrase is. So from Fajr adhan, you're not allowed to pray anything except for your Sunnah al-Fajr, and it has to be done on time, which means it's before your Fajr prayer, right? Sunnah al-Fajr is before prayer, not after prayer. Which means that if you miss that one and you wanted to make it up, you cannot do it right after Salat al-Fajr, because now it's waqt al-nahi. You can't pray it. He says, Sunnah al-Fajr ada'an. Praying Fajr, ada' means on time. Qada' means made up. So if you wanted to make it up, and it's recommended to make up the Sunnah Ratiba. Those 10 that we mentioned, it's recommended to make them up. But in the case of Salat al-Fajr, it would mean you would have to wait until the waqt al-nahi concluded, and then you make up your Sunnah al-Fajr there. All right, so this prohibition also means, a prohibition means it's impermissible to begin a voluntary prayer during one of the prohibited times, and if you were to do that, the prayer would be invalid. If you were to start a prayer during that waqt al-nahi, the prayer is invalid, besides what was mentioned. Even if the person is ignorant of the ruling or unaware that it is the time of prohibition, it's invalid, because the prohibition entails invalidity. Al-hurma, right? Taqtadi al-fasad is the kind of the rule that we're using, that when you are talking about something haram when it comes to prayer, then it basically leads to or necessitates invalidity. And this applies even to voluntary prayers that have a cause or a reason, such as Sujūd tilawa, prostration for hearing the Quran. So if you were listening to the Quran after Salat al-Fajr and you came across a ayah of sujood, you would refrain from doing that. Sujood is shukr, the same. You would wait until later. Emphasize sunnahs like the Sunnah of Fajr if prayed after Fajr or after Asr time. So we mentioned, just describe that. Salat al-Kusūf, this is the eclipse prayer. Salat al-Istisqāʼ, the rain prayer. You're not praying it during prohibited times. Tahiyyat al-Masjid. You don't pray that during prohibited times. Sunnah al-Wudu and Salat al-Istikhara, all are not prayed during prohibited times. This is due to the generality of the prohibition, which takes precedent over the permissive reports about other acts, other prayers. The principle is that a prohibitive command overrides a permissive one. Al-Hadir muqaddam al-Mubih, essentially is what Imam Bahuti mentions. There's an explicit prohibition, and that's taken precedent when it's in contrast to a permissive report. You can pray these prayers. These are recommended prayers, but now there's a prohibition which overrides that. And if a prayer was begun before the prohibited time, it is impermissible to continue into that prohibited time, but it will still be valid. So you can't linger on. What should be done is you quickly finish. If you know that the extent that prohibited time begins, then you should quickly wrap up your prayer so as not to be praying during that time. And there are those four exceptions. There are other exceptions to this rule. Prayers that have been made obligatory by way of a nadhr, which is an oath, they become obligatory prayers, similar to the 5 daily prayers that if you miss, that you make them up at any time. To repeat a congregational prayer that has already been performed while one is in the masjid. Like you're lingering, hanging out, you've already prayed Salat al-Asr, and now there's a congregation for Salat al-Asr. You say, it's Asr time, I've already prayed, it's waqt al-nahi. But now, because there's another congregation happening, here's an exception that you join that because of the nature of congregational prayer. And there's reports of this from the Prophet ﷺ, that you join the prayer and it will be for you like a nafilah. This overrides that. This is an exception to that rule. And the other exception here, Tahiyyat al-Masjid, when one enters during the Friday khutbah. The exception applies unconditionally here. If you come in during the Friday khutbah, it doesn't matter if it's waqt al-nahi or not, which means it could be right at the zawal. Because in the madhab, the Hanbali madhab, you can pray Salat al-Jumu'ah before Salat al-Dhuhr. Which means you could be doing the khutbah and there's the zawal right there. So it doesn't matter. Because this is explicitly found in the Sunnah, that if you come in, the khutbah's going, then you make the Tahiyyat al-Masjid quickly and you sit. So those are some exceptions as well that go along with that. And that's where we're going to wrap up for today. Inshallah, we'll pick up here talking about congregational prayer, its ruling, its place of performance or places of performance, and other associated manners and beyond. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll see you next time. Thank you for your attendance, your attentive listening. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina.